Good afternoon, and welcome to this online event that will explore key areas of support needed for Black, Asian and minority ethnic students during the coronavirus pandemic. My name is Amy Norton, and I'm the Head of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at the Office for Students, and I will be, technology permitting, chairing this webinar. We were overwhelmed by the number of registrations that we received for this event in such a short period of time, and I would like to take this moment to thank every one of you for taking time out of your afternoons to join us for this important event. The OFS, in its role as regulator of higher education in England, aims to ensure that every student, whatever their background or level of study, has a fulfilling experience of higher education that enriches their lives and careers. Our ambition is that future generations should have equal opportunities to access and succeed in higher education. Access and participation has been a top priority for the OFS, and one of our key performance measures is to eliminate the gap in degree outcomes between white and Black students. The coronavirus pandemic is affecting us all in so many ways, and although we strive for a new normal, we are aware of the impact on individuals, groups and communities. The impact on HE has already been massive, and we've worked with the sector to support providers and disseminate information, advice and guidance. This is including briefing notes on supporting student groups that might be vulnerable to the impact of the pandemic. So already published are briefing notes on supporting international students, students without family support, and supporting student mental health. We hope that this event will support colleagues and students inside and outside of the sector in developing approaches and activities to support Black, Asian and minority ethnic students during this time. So the format of today's event will be as follows. We'll shortly start with a panel session discussion between Gary Loke, Sarah Howells and Ian Dunn on how the sector can ensure equality during the coronavirus pandemic for Black, Asian and minority ethnic students. Each of the speakers will make some opening remarks for 5 minutes each, and then we'll open it to questions and discussion for about half an hour. We'll then break for 10 minutes before our second panel discussion. The second discussion will focus on the impact on learning and teaching, and I'll be joined by Ghanam Singh, Sarah El-Kawad and Alison Shaw. We're planning for each session to run for around 45 minutes, and we'll finish just before 3 o'clock. So just before we start, a little bit of housekeeping. So this event is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube after the event. Closed caption subtitles are being used. I'm afraid because Zoom does not have an automatic closed captioning function, you'll need to click on the link, which is now visible in the chat. As we approach future online events, we will strive to make these as accessible as possible, and we'd welcome feedback on how this could be improved next time. I'm very fortunate, I'm very grateful to my colleagues who are working behind the scenes to support us. So if any reason my connection drops out, and hopefully it won't, but one of my colleagues will temporarily take over chairing responsibilities. If you experience any technical issues during the event, particularly around the connection and accessing of the Zoom and the webinar function, then you can contact a member of our team using the chat. Thank you to those who've already submitted questions for our panelists. If you've got a question or anything springs to mind as we're working through the panel's presentations, these can be asked in the Q&A function in Zoom. With such a high number of participants today, it is possible that we won't get through all of your questions, but we will look to pick those up in a written Q&A after the event. Questions submitted through the Q&A will be anonymised when we ask them to the panel. After the event, we'll be circulating an evaluation form to participants who have agreed to receive one. This is the first online event of this kind that the OFS has organised, and we would welcome all and any feedback you'd like to give us. After the event, we'll be developing an online space for hosting and sharing resources and activities that have been developed to support Black, Asian and minority ethnic students during the pandemic. And we would be interested to receive your case studies. So the email address is on the PowerPoint slide that will appear during the panel breaks, and I'll also read it out at the end. So that's it for the housekeeping. Before we move into the main the panel discussion, I just wanted to take this moment to acknowledge the events of the last week. The killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter demonstrations across the US and the UK. individual racism and institutional racism are present in our culture, systems, and structures. Higher education is not immune. And despite the hard work of colleagues, activists, and allies over the last few decades, there are persistent inequalities in access, participation, and experience. I would like to pay tribute and give thanks to the emotional and intellectual efforts that have paved the way for the advances we've already seen from many academics, support and professional staff, student leaders, and particularly people from people of colour. The OFS is clear of the fundamental need to continue and develop this work, and for that work to be informed by the lived experiences of Black students and staff. Supporting the victims of harassment, discrimination and hate crime is a space that the OFS has taken a very active role in. Resources from OFS funded Catalyst projects are available on our website, and we're hoping soon to unpause our consultation that we currently have open around addressing sexual misconduct and harassment. We know that we must continue this work and challenge ourselves and the sector and continue on our individual and organisational journeys towards anti-racism. Now, I think that leads us quite nicely into our first panel session, which is focusing on how the sector can ensure equality during the coronavirus pandemic for Black, Asian and minority ethnic students. So each panellist will be given the opportunity to speak, as I said, before we take questions from participants. So our panel members for this first session are Sarah Howells, my colleague at the Office for Students, and she is Head of Access and Participation Regulation and Funding. We're also pleased to welcome Gary Loke, Director of Knowledge, Innovation and Delivery at Advanced HE, and Ian Dunn, Provost at Coventry University. So we'll start with Sarah. As Head of Access and Participation Regulation and Funding, Sarah leads on these areas, ensuring that they deliver the OFS's statutory duties, as well as its strategic objectives and ambitions for access, success and progression for students from underrepresented groups. More specifically, Sarah leads on work relating to higher education providers' access and participation plans, ensuring that the OFS reforms to access and participation are made a reality through clear expectations on the level of commitment and ambition their plans should deliver. Sarah also leads on AMP funding, including student premiums and the Uni Connect programme. Sarah, over to you.
It's Amy. If Sarah's having technical difficulties, would you like to swap the order? I'm happy to go first if necessary.
That's really kind, Gary. Shall I just give you a quick introduction?
Yeah. Okay, sure.
Thank you. So Advanced HE, Gary is responsible for leading on research, thought leadership and content delivery of their services. Prior to his current role, Gary was Deputy Chief Executive at the Equality Challenge Unit, leading on numerous projects, including joint guidance with the EHRC and Universities UK on the intersection of equality legislation and the Prevent Duty. And Gary's contributed to Jason Arday and Heidi Mertz's 2018 book, Dismantling Race in Higher Education, Racism, Whiteness and Decolonising the Academy, as well as his own publications on racial inequality and harassment in higher education. Gary, thank you so much. Please take it away.
You're welcome. Thank you, everybody. Can you hear and see me all right? Yes. Great. So thank you, first of all, to the OFS for putting this event together, and to Gurnham, who is speaking on the second panel, for this idea of a panel discussion. I think it's always timely to talk about race equality. I think I've worked in the sector of race equality for a very long time, and for me, I suppose the kind of as Amy said, the recent events in response to the killing of George Floyd, I guess, coupled with the kind of repeated message at the moment that we at different BAME communities are at greater risk of serious impacts from coronavirus, has really given us a heightened kind of concern about well-being of people, feeling angry, feeling anxious, and that's much more acute, I think, with a number of BAME communities. And I was interested seeing all the responses that kind of universities have put out about the Black Lives Matter campaign, because I think it's driven quite a lot of debate about messaging being one thing and actions that follow. So what are the actions that we will take to put, to kind of right this injustice? And so when I was thinking about, as universities start to think about opening campuses or planning to open, I would urge institutions to think about the same thing, think about the messaging, but also the actions that follow. I've noticed quite a few institutions, for example, saying we will be opening campuses in September, or or, you know, we are open. But I'm not sure the messaging is nuanced enough to think about, you know, what if you were a Black man sitting there in a room who's shielding, feeling vulnerable, and the message is come back in September, you know, or you're a member of staff being told, oh yeah, we're opening, come back, without actually thinking about the kind of equality impacts of what it means to be opening campuses. You know, I think we need to recognize the kind of heightened well-being issues, heightened anxiety, heightened, you know, reported loneliness, stress, and work through those things. So it's not just about the messaging, but the action that follows from it. I guess the next point I wanted to make really is, and I say this in everything that I speak, and I use the term BAME as a collective really, and I won't go to the political history of Blackness, but I think that's really important. And I use the term BAME here, but remembering that it's not that monolith, it's not this homogenous group, we are not all the same people. And I'm particularly interested in this area because I've seen the kind of rise in hate crime, or the reported rise in hate crime against kind of South and East Asian communities. And I must say for the longest time, having lived in London for many, many years, it's actually become much more apparent to me. You know, I've had hate crime directed at me, but it has been more recent, actually, some of the verbal abuse that I've had in London, which has been particularly striking considering the kind of community I live in and where I live in London. But I think it's really important that we be mindful of how this plays out in the virtual HE space as we move on to online teaching and learning, online meetings, and also how it will play out in terms of thinking about your community response. So particularly when we see, if and when we see the return to campuses opening, particularly where, you know, there is already issues of hate crime, what the community might perceive in terms of they see an influx of students returning, you know, the tension between them, particularly if, you know, you see Asian students returning and there is already kind of a heightened racial tension and fear. So thinking about specific groups and where that tension might lie when we start to reopen campuses and what that might look like. I also think it's important to break the monolith down even further. So it's not just, you know, thinking about ethnicity, but thinking about its intersections. We know, for example, that the intersection with social economic status is really important in terms of access to time, space, to digital technology, you know, thinking about how we engage different students in terms of what time they have, whether it's asynchronous learning, synchronous learning, bite-sized learning for those who are time poor. How do you think about those issues? Thinking about the intersection between gender and the increasing evidence of the domestic responsibilities and the unequal gender divide that's been placed on them. Thinking about the intersections with people who live in multi-generational households. We know that that's an issue, particularly for certain kind of BAME communities. Thinking, for example, about LGBT plus students who may be at home in environments where they are not accepted by families. Or not accepted. So just thinking about what those intersections are and how hard it is for those people. The next point I wanted to make really is, I've just got a 1 minute warning, so my 5 minutes are very quick. The next 2 points, I'm going to be very quick here, that I wanted to make is to think about co-producing with students. I've been on a lot of webinars recently where we talked about reopening campuses, what we're going to do, how we're planning, and I was struck by the lack of a student voice in the room on a lot of these. And I think if we don't involve students, what we will be doing is doing to students as opposed to co-producing with students. And one of the really nice examples I came across recently, which I've put a race lens on to, is if we know that graduate students, for example, graduates this year are going to be worried about employment, and we also know that we're worried about transitions of certain students. One institution was talking about retaining its graduates as peer mentors, peer paid mentors, to help with their transitions from year 1 to year 2, for example, or to help with induction. And if you put a race lens on it, you could say, actually, you know, we could be retaining some of our BAME graduates to support the transitions of BAME students coming in. My final point, and as I'm on time, is to not lose sight of the bigger picture. As we learn from this rapid response, you know, think about, you know, for example, we've been working on closing the awarding gap for a while, inclusive teaching and learning practices, reimagining assessment. We've done it very quickly to make it very flexible because we've had to, and actually think about whether we could build that flexibility into future work so that we don't lose this and not lose sight of the bigger picture and just not return to what was the old normal, because that was the old normal where we know there were structural disadvantages anyway. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Gary. I'm certainly taking away your points around intersectionality. I think that's so important. I think that's a theme that we'll absolutely want to carry throughout this webinar this afternoon. Sarah, have you managed to find a way to join us with sound?
Yes, I hope so. Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you very much, Sarah. Over to you.
Yes, the whole thing just went out on me, so I do apologise for that. Thank you. Thank you, Amy. I just want to start by echoing Amy's comments about how pleased we are to be hosting this event today. What's happened over the last week, as Amy said, underscores the urgent need for the work that you're all undertaking. We're very clear about our ambitions. Our primary aim, as Amy said, is to ensure that every student, whatever their background, has a fulfilling experience of higher education that enriches their lives and careers. It's written into the legislation that created the OFS that we must have regards to the need to promote equality of opportunity in connection with access to and participation in higher education. So this underscores our approach to our work in access and participation. We focus on eradicating gaps in access to, success within and progression from higher education that exist for underrepresented student groups. We have ambitious key performance measures, one of which is to eradicate the gap in degree outcomes between Black and white students within a generation and to significantly reduce it over the next 5 years. But we're not the experts here by any means. We're a principles-based regulator, and as such, we'll be holding providers to account and expecting them to make progress they promised in their recently approved access and participation plans. But the work will be done by providers and students. The knowledge, experience and expertise resides in you, and by you I mean staff and students and your colleagues. What we're able to do is ensure that providers give this the strategic priority and scrutiny it needs. We've now assessed and approved well over 200 access and participation plans. In January this year, we published a report based on the analysis of 171 of those plans. Our emphasis is on individual providers closing gaps between different groups within their own student populations. And this is important, as allowing providers to simply compare their performance against the sector average could lead to complacency and slow down the change that is so urgently needed. When we looked at student success targets that providers had set, those that address non-continuation and degree outcomes, 293 targets were in respect of ethnicity, with the next largest group being 122 in respect of disability. Of the 293, 112 targets were to reduce the gap in degree outcomes between Black and white students. Now, if all those targets are achieved, we would see the gap in outcomes between those groups reduced from the massive 22 percentage points it currently is to 11 percentage points in 2024-25, so halving the gap in 5 years. And that represents a massive step change in the level of ambition in the sector that we've seen to date. Now, of course, we're in the middle of a pandemic, which has caused major disruption for all students. But we know it's likely to have a disproportionate impact on underrepresented student groups, and that includes many of those who are from ethnic minority groups. We know that the virus has exacerbated and created further vulnerabilities, not least in terms of greater risk the virus poses to certain ethnic minority groups, posing threats to both their physical and mental health and well-being. We also know that shifting of provision online is likely again to impact on underrepresented student groups, who are also more likely to be from lower socioeconomic groups where digital poverty is a real and live issue. Universities, colleges and other HE providers have had to move quickly to change what they do and continue to deliver learning to and support for their students. For the OFS, this has meant suspending a lot of our requirements to give providers the space they needed to make those extensive adjustments to how they operate. However, we are clear that providers would need to make reasonable decisions in respect of meeting the commitments in their current access and participation plans, so those covering the current academic year, and in the newly approved 2020-21 onwards plans. And we were equally clear that they had to honour in full commitments they made in respect of direct financial support to students in both of those plans. But providers are able to repurpose investment originally intended for commitments they're no longer able to deliver, such as face-to-face outreach in schools during the pandemic, and use that to further support students now. We're very clear that we still expect providers to continue to make progress they have committed to in their 2020-21 onwards plans. And this means continuing to do the work that will enable them to deliver on the ambitious targets they've set. Many providers with targets to address the awarding gap, for example, are committed to reviewing both curriculum and pedagogy, and it remains critical that this work continues, even more so as providers move into what might be a new normal in respect of learning and teaching, as Gary has just talked about. Similarly, commitments to improving diversity of staff, deliver unconscious bias training, work with students and student unions to co-create provision and develop student support frameworks, as well as setting KPIs and developing whole-provider strategic approaches, all of which are there in the plans, remain critical to closing gaps and becoming inclusive and safe environments for students. And that's my 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I think it's really helpful to have that sort of those underlying principles really set out there from around the OFS's regulation, but also some intelligence and insight from the plans that have been submitted and reviewed over the last 8 months or so. So we're slightly out of order, but we're now back on track as we're going to pass over to Ian Dunn. So Ian is Provost at Coventry University, and prior to his current role, Ian worked as Deputy Vice-Chancellor focusing on student experience, Pro-Vice-Chancellor on student empowerment, and as an academic in engineering and computing at Coventry University. As Provost, Ian's responsibilities include student services, the Students' Union, and the learning and teaching function of the university. He is a board member of the Midlands Academies Trust and a Justice of the Peace in Coventry and Warwickshire. Ian, over to you for your 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you to OFS for organising this event. I'd like to start by saying thank you to my very dear friend and colleague, Dunn, for the paper that provoked this conversation, which is very much appreciated. And of course, I must start by expressing my outrage at the murder of George Floyd. It's a call for us all to even greater action to answer some of the questions that.
I think Ian might have just frozen there for a second. We might just give him another few seconds to see whether he's able to join us back again. Otherwise, we might just move to taking a question. Ian, you're back with us. You just froze up there for a second, about 30 seconds ago.
Yes, I'm terribly sorry about that. That's I've come onto campus as well in order to have the best connection I could possibly have through the networks. And there we go. There, this is some of the difficulties that we're facing right now. Access, success, progress. Access into universities and fair access, equal access and opportunity for everyone. Success so that everyone can achieve their full potential whilst in a university, but equally progress, and that picks up on one of Gary's points, progress on beyond from the universities, and therefore universities' responsibilities in challenging the professions about equity of access into those, so that everyone has onward progression from university. I'd like to make a number of comments really to do with the way in which we make the curriculum accessible. I'd like to make a few comments about the support services, and particularly the relationship that we have with our Students' Union and others, to make sure that it's not just the teaching and learning experience, but the broader experience which is covered, and about the emergency support that we make available for all sorts of students. And just to emphasise again Gary's point about the intersectionality, we're absolutely talking about BAME students, but we need to think about those students in that richness of diversity and complexity, about the role of commuting students, the role of parental responsibilities of mature students, and all of the other intersectionality that make these questions incredibly complicated. So, from my perspective, right now we absolutely must not repeat some of the mistakes that have been made in the past, and all of the work that's going on to address curriculum, the decolonisation of the curriculum, the way in which that curriculum is conceived in an online or blended environment, the way in which we use our campuses, addressing absolutely Gary's point about about every one of our students having different perceptions and different situations, and needing to be thoughtful about how we make access to to our curriculum. We need to think about the points that Sarah made regarding access to technology. But it's not only about the access to technology, it's also about how we use the technology, and it's about how we conceive and deliver the curriculum through technology. There are things that are within our control at the moment, and we need therefore to have a very serious conversation with our students about how they access the curriculum through technology, not the way in which we perceive that access to be made. And what I mean by that is the use of mobile technologies and the way in which we can liberate the curriculum through mobile technologies rather than through broadband Wi-Fi connections that are perhaps more familiar to many of us. We do need to think about the relationship of space and the opportunity to study in circumstances which allow that study to be under the best conditions. But I want to finish really by talking about the role of the Students' Union and the conversation with our students, both from a university to student perspective and through the Students' Union, making sure that we understand really what the experiences are that they are in right now, and what those experiences are going to be in the next phase, and making sure that we build that in through the design of our curriculum and our support services to make sure that they're accessible to all. I think I'll leave it there for now. 5 minutes, there we go.
Thank you so much, Ian. That concludes our presentations from our panellists and moves us through to the question and answer stage. Please do send in any questions using the Q&A function that you can see down below, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. If you direct a question to a panellist and we don't have time to answer it, or ask it, sorry, we'll endeavour to answer it offline and post a response on our webpage. And that'll go on the webpage of resources and support that is being developed and published by the OFS following this event. Okay, so if the panellists from the first panel, I think, could unmute their microphones so that we're ready to throw to you, as it were. So the first question I'm going to direct towards Sarah, and it is: what role can the OFS play to help the higher education sector support Black, Asian and minority ethnic students in the 2021 academic year? Okay,
thanks, Amy. I think that we have already set out quite clearly what our expectations are of providers, and we did a lot of work in 2018 to set out our proposals for reforming access and participation and our approach to access and participation. And as I say, we've just recently been assessing new access and participation plans with providers, and we have very clear expectations around the continued delivery of those plans. We have obviously said to providers that we will be taking current circumstances into account when it comes to looking at how commitments are being delivered and have been delivered over this period. And we're also doing a lot of work, because we do have a clear role in effective practice around all of our work on access and participation. Again, that's written into the legislation, that we have a role to promote, identify and promote good practice. And so we'll be working very, very actively. The issues around the awarding gap between ethnic minority students and white students is a key issue for us. It's something that we have a clear action plan around, and it's something that we will be taking forward in terms of working with the What Works Centre TASO as well. So there's a number of different strands to the work that we can do. I think primarily, though, I would say that we are continuing to have very high expectations of providers as they move into, as they come up through this academic year and they move into the next academic year. We are very clear that they should be taking all reasonable steps to deliver the commitments that they've put in. And as I've said, many providers who have set targets in this space have also talked about the strategic measures they will be undertaking to deliver on those targets. And we will be hoping that we can see very real evidence that that has been happening. We have suspended a lot of our regulatory functions at present during this current time, but we will be monitoring, we will be coming back to see what providers are doing in this space, and we will be asking questions about where we've seen that work hasn't been delivered that was promised.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Sarah. Gary, you picked up on the sort of anti-Asian racism and harassment, hate and abuse that is being experienced, and I wondered whether you would just expand a little bit about how we can strengthen the sector's response to some of this racism which is being triggered by COVID-19.
Thanks, Amy. I think there are a number of things, really. One is, I think institutions, I think sometime last year we all, hopefully have all seen the EHRC's report into kind of harassment, hate crime, and so on. And I think it was, for many of us who have worked on race and racism, it wasn't a shock in terms of we knew that this was happening, but I think for a lot of institutions it was a bit of a shock to say actually these things are happening on our campuses and we don't really know about it. There was a disconnect, I think, with institutions knowing what was happening and on their campuses and what their students were reporting. I'm heartened that the UUK together with us have worked on, we're still on a working group with this, trying to work through how institutions strengthen their responses in terms of mechanisms to support students. But I'm also concerned, and I think that we need to think about our response in terms of working with. It can't be just institutions working on their own. We have to work with the communities that we serve, and so making sure there are proper partnerships with services, but also working with students. And I think this is the bit I talked about, that kind of co-creation. A lot of what we were. A lot of in terms of how students are feeling in terms of that kind of micro inequities, microaggressions, how we might deal with some of those, working with students and staff to educate people. And I think we use those terms for people who know what they mean quite easily and fluidly, but for people who don't, they don't know what that is really, and so we need to work with people about what that means, and really opening up the conversation about race. And I think that applies to all of us, really. Even when I first started working in race equality many years ago, I think there's a fear, and there's always been this fear of what to say, what is wrong, what is the right words. And actually, there is something about creating the dialogue that will allow people to talk about race, to be able to express how they're feeling. And I think that's what institutions need to explore. How do they lead on race equality? How do they make it okay to talk about race, to put your head up as a parapet and say, actually, there is an issue here and I want you to deal with it, and institutions then knowing how to respond. I don't think we've got there yet, and I think that's part of what institutions need to do, about strengthening the capacity of their staff and students to understand the issues, to talk about the issues and react to the issues in an appropriate way.
Thank you, Gary. Actually, Ian, I wondered whether from a senior leadership perspective in a provider, you might have a comment to make there as well on some of the responses you might be planning in Coventry.
Absolutely, and to pick up on both the AHRC report and the work that UUK were doing on race and on sexual violence and all sorts of other issues, making sure that there is both a reporting mechanism, anonymous and that's very visible, anonymous and named, if people wish to stand up, and I encourage people to do that. But also then doing something with it. And it's really important. There are lots of systems that have been created which are, the fact of reporting seems to be the ultimate goal. That's I'm afraid not good enough. Then putting in place, and that's an investment from a university perspective, and a considerable one at that, with advisors, mediators and counsellors to pick up those cases and to go back both to the reporter and to the incident, and to figure out what learning there is institutionally, what learning there is at an individual level, and then university leadership have to be sufficiently robust. And I'm sorry to say this, but where there is demonstrable, where a case is made, then taking direct action, whether it be against students or against staff, it must be taken. It cannot be tolerated, and it must be done swiftly and appropriately. And secondly, the way in which we build, and we're in the process of rebuilding our Equality, Diversity, Inclusion was formerly a committee. It was seen as part of the committee structure, and it needs to be part of the committee structure, but the terminology needs to change. We're trying to change the whole language around this to allow both an institutional and a ground up approach, both from students and staff feeding into the same community, and allowing we've actually taken the student union approach to building their council and taken it into the university and built an Equality Diversity Council which works in multiple layers, and we have councillors to represent race and disability and so on that are elected from within the population, and then groups and networks that represent individual difference. You know, as a member of the LGBTQ community, I identify with the G part as a gay man, and that voice needs to be loud as part of the whole. And so trying to create a two-way dialogue has been really important. We're nowhere near there yet, but we're absolutely committed to understanding that, because that can then influence the way we build the institution for the future.
Thank you, Ian. I think that leads really nicely on to a question we've received around, we've talked about intersectionality and just acknowledging those intersections, acknowledging those the range of personal characteristics, both protected and just factors in people's lives, like what type, what type of way which they're accessing their learning, for example, whether they live on campus or not, for example. So what intersectional approaches do you suggest for supporting Black, Asian and minority ethnic students? I don't know who wants to start with that, perhaps. Perhaps Gary, and then I can pass it around.
Sorry, can you repeat the question, Amy? I'm just pondering it in my head now.
So what intersectional approaches do you suggest for supporting Black, Asian and minority ethnic students?
I suppose I'm not sure I could talk about a blanket kind of approach. I think one has to look at the identity is complicated, as we know, and I think race is only part of it. And even if you kind of split race down, you know, it becomes such a complex area. And I think it's about looking at, you know, like if you were looking at staff, for example, let's do that. And I've been having some discussions about this in the morning, thinking about when we return to campuses, what are some of the EDI things that we will need to think about when we open spaces? How do we provide flexible working for different people, whatever their gender, their ethnicity, their race, and so on? Who's feeling safe? Who's not feeling safe to respond or to return to campuses? And we said actually what we were looking at was perhaps, you know, going back to first principles is good line management practice about understanding what people's needs are, how we might accommodate or not accommodate them. And this is where you start to take a kind of intersectional lens about, you know, but it might be about gender, it might be about gender and disability, it might be gender, childcare and race, living in, you know, where you might live and so on. That's important. So you start to take that approach. Now, obviously we couldn't take an individual approach of everything because it become too complicated. So what I've been thinking about in terms of teaching and learning, for example, is whether we could provide some structure in terms of choice. So I think the choice model is a very important one, where we give people choice about what they want to engage with, how they want to engage, but it can't be unlimited, because otherwise that becomes unmanageable. And the phrase that I came across that day when I was running a different roundtable was choice within a palette, which I really like actually. So you might say, okay, we know that the learning outcome for this course is X. We could teach it face-to-face, we could teach it blended, we could teach it or completely online. But we know that not everybody wants to go this way. However, we know we can achieve the learning outcomes through blended and completely online. As long as they're equitable experiences and outcomes, we can go either way. So that's your first layer. You say, here's your first choice. Then you say the next part of the palette is, well, what do we know about assessments? You know, does it have to link back to a PSRB in terms of what the regulations say? You know, how do we assess students? And I think there was a question earlier, which was in our chat, which I think was a technical chat, but someone asked about reimagining assessments, because I mentioned it. And actually, we've been quite creative in this process to say, you know, universities have suddenly gone from, you know, what were meant to be face-to-face exams into virtual spaces, or maybe not assessing at all, saying actually, maybe we assess too much. And that's what I mean by actually, could we reimagine what we've learned from this? And say, actually, we know that face-to-face written exams have structural disadvantages for certain people. Can we reimagine what a university might look like without them? Because we've done it. So why can't we continue to say, actually, we can have flexible assessment or less assessment going forward? So that's your next part of your palette, where you say, actually, here are your choices about how you measure the outcome to make sure that the learning gain is done. So we could put a framework together that has a kind of different choice bits it gives people who are providing teaching and learning the kind of framework to which they can build their curriculum and design it, but it also gives students the understanding of what is possible through this course, and therefore they can apply their own intersections into this. This works for me because I understand this bit is asynchronous, and therefore in bite-sized chunks. I'm time poor because I have childcare, or I live in a multi-generational household and I don't have access to space and place at the time I need it, or don't have access to broadband when I need it. And therefore you build that kind of model where you look at the intersections in different ways. So that's a very long answer.
No, I think that's really helpful, Gary. I wanted to, Ian, is there anything you want to add to that?
I'd just take it back a stage further, which is to say, universities, I'm afraid, are full of people of my generation, and we're rather responsible for designing the experience based on the experience that we had, and we have to stop that. Things have moved on enormously over that time. So building the mechanisms, and really building the mechanisms that have those conversations with students, making sure that our students' unions are able to be properly representative, because historically that's not always been the case too, is so important. And then making sure that, I'm not in any way saying the campus experience isn't right for some people. Of course it is, but there are so many of our students in all parts of our sector in the English higher education system who are not engaging in the way that it's conceived of, because of history. If I'm a student in London, in an institution in central London, then I may be spending an hour and a half traveling in. Right now, that's incredibly difficult. My students, we talk about commuting students. Commuting students are just, there are so many types of commuting students. There are the commuting students because they've got caring responsibilities. There's the commuting students because of cost of living. There's commuting students because they're incredibly, I have students who live in London and drive to Coventry to come and study because the parents have property in London. There are all sorts of forms of commuting, and so I think we've got to stop being designing on the past and start to really build about the future. And we need to do it urgently, actually.
Thank you, Ian. Sarah, is there anything you wanted to add, or I'm happy to move on?
Well, I think this is an issue that we've recognised, and we've recognised it within the process of the access and participation plans themselves, where we've said that institutions should be including consideration of different characteristics, so an intersectional analysis of characteristics within that, so that they can understand their student populations, and so that they're not designing interventions that actually are not taking account of associations between different characteristics. And so we've also produced the sort of statistical analysis that does that as well, actually called the association between characteristics, the APCs analysis, which is experimental currently, but gives us a much clearer idea of the particular difficulties and challenges faced by students with multiple different characteristics that are all adding into what they themselves experience. And I think there's a huge amount to learn from the work that's been done around universal design in respect of disabled students, for example, and making sure that we apply that more broadly, because students across the piece can really benefit from the principles behind some of that. And that really does take that social model into play. It thinks about the challenges that are put in people's way in terms of various different characteristics that they may show, and the way in which institutions can then respond to that. So I think there's a lot out there already that we need to learn from, that we bring into play when we talk about people and treating people as individuals with multiple characteristics, which need to be taken into account.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm now going to take two questions sort of together because I feel like they overlap quite strongly, and we're moving into the field of sort of student engagement. And the first question is about how do we ensure meaningful engagement with Black, Asian and minority ethnic student groups during the pandemic? And then there's another question which I think we can put the answers together on, which is how best we can reach out to students to gather their views about reopening. So this is a question about both engagement during the pandemic and then engaging to gather their views about reopening. Who would like to address that first? Is that something that Ian, you'd be interested in commenting on?
Well, of course. I mean, but engaging with students and trying to engage with as many students as you possibly can right now is as important as it was before, and as important as it will be in the future. It's just the mechanisms through which we're doing that at the moment are changed. We're certainly trying to do it through academic means, through the faculties, through the leadership and the student engagement and a team. I'm very lucky. I've got a large student engagement, effectively call centre that are reaching out to my students right now, and we gather those individual voices, and we try to bring those together so that we influence design, but bringing those into the Students' Union. I can't emphasise enough the value of a strong and loud voice from the Students' Union, and I'm delighted that I have that because it one, challenges, and two, supports and translates the message into ways in which so it's about gathering as many voices as possible, bringing them back, and then doing something about it, and closing the loop, and making sure people know that those voices have been heard. They may not have been directly responded to. Individual circumstances, as Gary was saying earlier, need to be brought together. But yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ian. Is there anything you'd like to add for either Sarah or Gary on students' engagement?
Quite difficult, I think, from our perspective, to talk about that in this particular set of circumstances. Student engagement is incredibly important, and we're very obviously very aware of the need for students to be involved and engaged, and certainly co-producers in many circumstances. But it's very difficult for us to talk right now about engaging students from an institutional perspective.
And not much. I think, thank you, Ian and Sarah. I think, Ian, you talked a lot about the Students' Union. I think that's really important. It's working through with student voices. One thing that I was struck by in a comment, I had a conversation with someone else, is making sure that institutions aren't just engaging about the, how do I'm trying to phrase this, not just engaging about when students are meant to be engaging with them, if that makes sense. So a lot of students are worried about, a lot of institutions are worried about, are students kind of coming to their virtual sessions? How are they engaging their academic workload? How are we going to do this? And actually, someone painted a very vivid picture of actually what we need to know as institutions is, what are those students doing when they're not engaging with us? Are they sitting in the room on their own because they're self-isolating, and they're just sitting there, they don't know what to do themselves, and their mental health is decreasing? So that engagement needs to be quite whole, about not just what they're doing when they engage with us academically, but also what are they doing when they're not engaging us, what they're doing the rest of their time, which I think is really important. The other thing I would add is, there's always, and I hesitate to say this, but there is a risk of over-engagement. I worry about the overuse of surveys, and students being bombarded sometimes with surveys on, should we survey students about what they think about what coming back? I guess the question is, if you're going to survey them, thinking about their fears about returning, before you do that, make sure you do something with that data, because there's no point you surveying and then you make a decision, well, actually, we're going to open anyway, because that's what we need to do. So what's the point of asking the question? So before you ask the question, think of the consequence, I think. And then that's an important thing, was we start to rethink about what, how, and when we will open campuses.
Can I just say, I would actually, we do need to do some engagement of our own very, very soon, because we want students to be really involved in the delivery of access and participation plans, and we want students to have their own voice in that process, if you like. And so we're looking very, very soon to try and do some proper engagement with students, so that they can feed into the development of the mechanism through which they're able to do that. And I would just send out a plea to our participants of this session. So if you have some ideas that you can send into us, we'd be really pleased to hear from you, because we do want to make sure that we get a diversity of voices included in this exercise as we can. And so we'd be really interested in how you think that we could best go about that.
Can I just step in very quickly to almost respond? Not quite, it's not perfect. We have a very significant project about the colonisation of the curriculum. The most important part of that team, with all respect to my academic colleagues who are supporting the academics and faculties, are the students that we employ on internships into that team. They add enormous value. So Sarah, I'm sure I would encourage you to reach out to universities to offer internships to students to come and work with the OFS on exactly those questions. Wonderful stuff.
Thanks very much, Ian, and thanks very much, Sarah, as well there. So a good plug from Sarah to submit case studies and come forward and help us with examples of some of your great practice, and a great plug from Ian for student co-creation there. So I'm so sorry. This absolutely pains me because we've had some brilliant questions in, which we're just not going to get time to address. I'm so sorry, but I'd like to really thank those participants who have submitted those questions. And we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but we are going to provide some written Q&A afterwards, some written answers to those afterwards. So I'd like to thank Gary, Sarah and Ian for their time and contributions, for Gary for stepping in out of order, which I really appreciate. I know I found our discussion and their insights just incredibly helpful. I think they've really set us off with some brilliant thoughts and ideas to take forward into the next session. So we're going to break now for 10 minutes before we start the second stage of our event, which will be focusing on the impact on learning and teaching more specifically. So we'll see you back here in 10 minutes.